Now we're going to discuss Latinx people in comics. And this section is going to be much shorter than it ought to be. And that's a shame. Well, to get started, now early on, whenever Hispanic people were represented in comic books throughout the Golden Age, it was mostly in westerns. Mostly in westerns, sometimes in a heroic guise, such as the Cisco Kid or Zorro, both of whom were characters from other media that were translated to comic books, and they were heroic. Although the Cisco Kid was sometimes portrayed as speaking very broken English, Zorro usually was not. But beyond those couple of good guy Western characters, most of the Mexican people portrayed in comics, and Mexican American people, were either bandits or they were helpless, victimized villagers who had to be saved from bandits. In comic books that aren't westerns, Latinx people were pretty hard to find, and that held true for a remarkably long time. And there really wasn't a Hispanic superhero until 1975 over at Marvel. Now, if you recall, maybe you do, maybe you don't, a little while ago when we were talking about Asian representation, I had a picture of the members of the Sons of the Tiger, which was three guys, a white guy, a black guy, and a Chinese guy. And then later they added another Asian woman. Well, they didn't have a Puerto Rican guy until they did. So in the pages of Deadly Hands of Kung Fu, which was a black and white magazine from Marvel, the Sons of the Tiger lost their powers because they had these magic amulets, right? And you put them all together, it makes one magic amulet, and threw them away. And Hector Ayala found the amulet, put it on, and became the White Tiger. Automatically, he was like a super powerful, super skilled kung fu artist. And he took over as the lead title in Deadly Hands of Kung Fu for many issues. He was created by the writer Bill Mantlo and George Perez, who was from the Bronx and the son of Puerto Rican immigrants. And Hector Ayala is Puerto Rican. This makes him the first Puerto Rican superhero for sure, and maybe certainly the first major, but he wasn't really major, superhero who was Hispanic. Anyway, his story becomes kind of convoluted over time. He gets grievously injured, and then he goes into retirement, and then he's replaced. His mantle is taken up by his sister, and then I think by his niece after that. But through all these versions, of course, it's all in the family, right? So they are all Puerto Rican. So that's 1975. DC introduced their first Latina superhero in 1979, actually in the pages of the Super Friends. Fire, alias Beatriz da Costa, who is from Brazil. Created, notice, by Ramona Fradon and E. Nelson Bridwell, which Ramona Fradon, if you'll remember, she was a long-time DC artist in the Silver Age. Fire would team up with a white woman named Ice, and they would be mainstays in the Justice League for many of their stories in the 1980s and early 90s. All right. Things are still happening slowly. Over in the pages of Power Man and Iron Fist in 1979, we met El Aguila, Alejandro Montoya, who is kind of a hero, sort of an anti-hero. Very much a Zorro ripoff. Dave Cockrum apparently really loved Zorro, and he wanted a Zorro character. El Aguila is sort of a bounty hunter type person, so sometimes he's on the same side as Power Man and Iron Fist, and sometimes he's not. His sword, his superpower is he discharges electric energy, and the sword is the thing by which he does it. So he's a supporting character, kind of morally ambiguous, but he was, at least a Hispanic character. Actually, a lot of, well, not a lot, but a few Hispanic villains showed up in Power Man. Well, Luke Cage, then Power Man, and Iron Fist. All right, well, 1982 saw the introduction of Sunspot. It actually saw the introduction of the New Mutants, one of whom was Karma, the Vietnamese immigrant superhero that we briefly looked at earlier. Sunspot, alias Roberto da Costa, known to his friends as Bobby, was also from Brazil and also named da Costa. So apparently he and Fire were not related. Anyway, he has continued to be kind of, whatever X book he's in this month. 1992, DC introduced the character of Renee Montoya, who was a Gotham City cop. And in fact, she was designed to be introduced in the Batman animated series on TV, just like Harley Quinn was. And so they rushed and put her in the comics at that time. Years later, 2007, she took over the superpowers and super identity of the Question. Late 99, the character of Echo was introduced in the pages of Daredevil, alias Maya Lopez, whose, let's see, her mother, I think, was Puerto Rican, definitely Latina, and her father was Cheyenne, making her both Latina and a Native American character, and also she happens to be deaf. So a lot of different things blended into that character, who was co-created by the Hispanic artist Joe Quesada. Now we're going to take a look at a couple of interesting characters who were introduced more recently, if you can call 9 years ago recent, in 2011. In 2011, the character America Chavez was introduced, the new Miss America, the first one since Madeline Frank. Yes, that was eventually her name. Anyway, she was in the Young Avengers, and then later she was in the West Coast Avengers. She was Latina, and she was gay, which made her the first Marvel LGBTQ woman, I think, to have their own comic title. She may have been the first with a regular ongoing title. Also in 2011, Miles Morales, a teenager in an alternate reality version of Earth where Peter Parker was killed, and this was in the Ultimates universe. And if you don't know what that is, just wait and we'll talk about it in length later. But suffice it to say, he lives on a parallel Earth where Peter Parker gets killed and he takes over as Spider-Man. Then later on, realities converge again and he winds up on quote-unquote this reality where there is a Peter Parker. So there's two Spider-Men. Way more than that, actually, if you've seen Into the Spider-Verse, the animated film that features Miles Morales and Peter Parker. Anyway, Morales was his mother was Puerto Rican and his father's African American, so that makes him both Latino and African American and a teenager. So anyway, he's been a remarkably popular character. Now there have been a lot more Latinx Hispanic characters since the 1990s, and I sound like a broken record. It would take a lot of time to enumerate all of them, but the sad part, and the reason that we got to that part so quickly, is that there were so few for so long, especially considering the proportion of the population that is Hispanic. And if you think about the fact that all those Asian characters started starring in kung fu oriented comics in the 70s, that they weren't aiming for the Asian American audience. They were aiming for the audience with money that was going to buy the comics because it was a popular movie trend. There were lots and lots of Hispanic people. There's a whole lot of Puerto Rican people, many of them in Puerto Rico, which is part of the United States. But they did not gear anything major toward them. Only the White Tiger, who was kind of second or third string, and after a few years, just kind of quietly disappeared for the most part. And sadly, the story is very similar when it comes to Latinx artists, writers, and etc. Well, any discussion of Latinx comic book creators has to start with Alex Schomburg, that we have discussed before when we were talking about the Golden Age. Born Alejandro Schomburg y Rosa, he had a Puerto Rican mother, and his father was of German descent. And I think he and his mother had moved to New York City when he was young, and he wound up working at Timely and later Atlas. So he worked on all those Marvel superheroes in their early years. Now, moving forward, it's kind of difficult to find a lot of names, and it's kind of like the situation with the Japanese and Chinese American comics professionals working during the early 1940s, where I was not able to find any images and there are no credits available. There were, according to several people who passed through the Timely offices in the early 40s, there were a number of Puerto Ricans working in the comic business, but they were doing those less glamorous jobs like colorist and letterer and production assistant and stuff like that. And to get to a prominent Hispanic comics writer or artist, you have to start with post-Golden Age. You really have to start with George Perez, who was, and well, still is, he's still alive, but in the 1970s was the first really big Latino comics star. He was one of the most sought-after artists of the late 70s and into the first half of the 1980s. In the 70s, he worked at Marvel on various titles, but is best known for his Marvel work for The Avengers. And then he wound up at DC doing the Justice League. So he covered the two big teams. And there was this long-rumored crossover event. Remember back in the late 70s and early 80s, there were all these Marvel and DC heroes meeting And there was one of the planning stages that word got out about that was going to be the Avengers meeting the Justice League, and George Perez was going to be doing the art, and everyone was excited, and it never happened. Well, it didn't happen for like 20, 25 years. It finally did happen, and George Perez did draw it. Now, probably what brought him the most attention was his work on Teen Titans, which had been canceled in the late 70s and then sort of relaunched with a lot of new characters and a couple of the original ones, sort of the same way that the X-Men had done. And Teen Titans rivaled the X-Men for popularity for a while there in the early 80s with the George Perez artwork. Some of the other Latino artists working at the time included Jim Aparo, who started at DC in the 60s and did a lot of Batman comics. He was the artist on Brave and the Bold, which had become a Batman team-up book for over 10 years. And then other Batman stories, including the famous Death in the Family storyline in, I think that was 1988. We'll talk about that later on. So his probably after Neil Adams, Marshall Rogers, and Jim Aparo were the Batman artists of that 25-year period. He also worked on Aquaman for a long time and The Spectre. Ernie Colon, who was like George Perez, of Puerto Rican descent. He worked at DC as well in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s on just about every title you can imagine. My sample here is from Turok Son of Thunder, which is a book that he did with Roy Thomas as the writer. Now, to go in a completely different direction, in the early 1980s, you find the Hernandez brothers from California, Mexican-American, three brothers who put together an independent comic called Love and Rockets in 1981 that they self-published and then shopped around and were able to get a deal with Fantagraphic Books, who started releasing Love and Rockets on a regular basis. This was right at the cusp of the independent comics movement. That is, the smaller companies getting attention that happened in the early 80s, and they were right in the forefront of that. Now, what the comic was is not something that the three of them all worked in different positions on doing. What it was is that each one did their own stories and had their own storylines and characters. Now, Mario, the oldest brother, was there at the beginning. It was the three of them, but he had a family, and he was having more and more responsibilities, bringing him away from being able to do the amount of work that required producing this artwork on a monthly basis. So he was around for the first couple of years or so, and then after that, you rarely saw his work, every once in a great while. So for the most part, Love and Rockets was produced by the other two brothers, and there was one storyline that was set in a village in Central America, and then another storyline was set in Southern California community. So a lot of recognition for them, and this was one of the first of that wave of independent comics that I saw and read, and it was very good. It still is. All right, well, like with all the other groups we've talked about, by the 1990s, you were starting to see a little more diversity in the comic book world, so far as creators and characters were concerned. By the year 2000, there were quite a number of Latino and Latina creators. So we will just focus on one of them who attained a certain degree, I guess, of prominence. And I'm talking about Joe Quesada, who was of Cuban descent from New York City, I think. He got started in the early 90s as an artist at Valiant Comics. And from there, he wound up working on several titles at Marvel and DC in the 90s until in 1998, he got on at Marvel as an editor. Not an editor of a book, but of a line. That's an experiment that Marvel did for a while in which they grouped like all the X-Men related books together under one editor and all the Avengers related books. And he was the editor of what were called the Marvel Knights, Knight, which included Daredevil, the Punisher, Cloak and Dagger, the Black Widow, and there's Shang-Chi. So he oversaw their books, their adventures, and then in the year 2000, he became editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics and held that position for 10 years. So from 2000 to 2010. And during that time, he was responsible for several storylines and major events that brought a lot more attention to Marvel. Marvel had kind of had a rough time in the late 90s. They had to declare bankruptcy. But with things like Civil War and the death of Captain America and, of course, subsequent return of Captain America, both storylines that I really enjoyed at the time. He was also responsible for some major changes to Spider-Man that I was not so pleased with, and you'll just have to wait in suspense if you don't know what I'm talking about until we get to that part later. I'm going to finish this section off by discussing a couple of individuals who were best known for the work that they did outside of conventional comic books. Starting with this guy, who we're looking at pictures of through the ages, Sergio Aragonis, who was born in 1937 in Spain, although his family moved away due to the Spanish Civil War when he was very young. By the time he was 6, he wound up living in Mexico, which is where he grew up, and became a cartoonist. When he was 25 years old, in 1962, he immigrated to the United States, and he took a portfolio of his drawings to the Madison Avenue offices of Mad Magazine, who were very impressed with his work and accepted some of his stuff right there on the spot. Several astronaut drawings they made into a feature. And here we have one of his cartoons. Actually, this is from 1970, which still resonates 50 years later. So he was very prolific. In fact, Al Feldstein said, the editor at Mad, that Sergio would have done the entire issue every month if we had let him. Now, when he first started working there, he had just arrived. He only had like $20 to his name, and so until he got on his feet, Mad publisher Bill Gaines let him live in his office, essentially sleep there overnight. Now later, he would also become known for his long-running comic book series that started off as an independent, then later was picked up by Marvel, Grew the Wanderer, which was a parody of Conan the Barbarian. So far as his work at Mad goes, though, what he's probably best known for is the fact that from 1962 until Mad essentially stopped producing new material in 2018, Sergio Aragonis was making these little cartoons in the margins all through the magazine. You know, he probably did like a dozen to 2 dozen of these per issue, and that happened month in and month out. And you know, when I was first reading Mad magazine in the mid '70s, I would look for those little cartoons, and usually I would enjoy those as much or more than the regular stuff. Now, this was in addition to his regular cartoons and features. And finally, let's look briefly at Manuel Rodriguez, best known by his pen name, Spain, sometimes referred to as Spain Rodriguez. Now, Sergio Aragonis was from Spain, and then he moved to Mexico, and then he moved to New York. Manuel Rodriguez was known as Spain, that was his nickname as a kid, but he wasn't from Spain. He was from Buffalo, New York. And in his late teens was a member of an outlaw biker gang. The type of sensibility that he kept for the rest of his life. But in 1969, he moved to New York City, to Greenwich Village specifically, to be a cartoonist. He was one of the early prominent figures in the underground comics movement. Now, the epicenter of the underground comics movement was San Francisco. However, Spain was on the cutting edge of that movement on the East Coast, in New York, where he initially was a cartoonist for the East Village Voice. We'll talk more about him when we talk about underground comics. All right, well, let's now take a look at Native American characters and creators, which mainstream Marvel and DC, very, very hard to find, but quite a few independent. So let's take a look at that. Of course, the earliest appearances of Native peoples in comic books in the United States was in Westerns, as almost always villains. Every once in a great while, perhaps a victim of oppression that needs protection from the white hero, or for those who had recurring roles, most often as sidekicks to the white hero, such as these two very famous comic strips that both started in 1938. On the left, the Lone Ranger, accompanied by Tonto, Lone Ranger, of course, originating in radio, and on the right, Red Ryder, which originated as a comic strip in 1938 and then became movies, movie serials, comic books, and so forth. And Red Ryder had a teenage sidekick who was Native American named Little Beaver. So that's the sort of thing, the sort of circumstances in which you saw Native Americans for the most part. Now, maybe the earliest example of seeing a Native hero in a different context was in 1940 with Johnny Fox, created by Paul Porter, who appeared in the pages of Champion Comics, which was the feature was set in modern times, so it was set in 1940, and the character Johnny Fox was a Seminole from Florida who was a college graduate whose grandfather was a medicine man that had invented these magical pellets that he put together that could turn you invisible. And then he was murdered, and the bad guy stole the pellets, and Johnny Fox caught them and swore to use his grandfather's invisible pellets for good. And thereafter, he usually appeared dressed in Western American style clothing. By Western, I don't mean like a cowboy. I mean like, from, um, the mainstream, like coat and tie type stuff. And becomes a private detective in New York City and solves crime and beats up on gangsters, while every once in a while also popping in down in Florida with his people down there. Of course, not long after that, 1941, we saw in Canada the debut of Nelvana of the Northern Lights, that we've talked about already, being the first Canadian superhero and the first female superhero or hero that was non-white. She was Inuit. Well, nonetheless, for the most part, as I said, Native Americans continued to appear in westerns, except that they started to often have the lead roles and be the heroes of their own comic books. And these are just a few examples, about a dozen. You've got, there's Frank Frazetta's White Indian, which was a common theme, sort of like Tarzan and other jungle men and jungle girls, the white person who takes on this other cultural identity and excels at it. And you've got Straight Arrow, Swift Arrow, Red Arrow, all the arrows. This is just a sampling. I mean, this is one dozen. There were many dozens of others. In fact, I don't know of a comprehensive list, but I would not be surprised if over the years there were not more than 100 comic book titles with Native Americans as the hero. Here's some that kind of stand out from the crowd for one reason or another. On the left, you have an issue of Firehair, warrior maid of the Wild Dakotas. Does that mean the Wild Dakota Territory or of the Dakota tribe and they're wild? Well, I guess either one. It's the adventures of this red-haired white lady who winds up being adopted into the Dakota People's Tribe. It's kind of a Jungle Girl comic, but with Native Americans instead of in Africa. From Fiction House Comics, started in 1945 and ran to 1952. Another interesting character is Red Wolf from Marvel Comics. First appeared in 1970 in Avengers number 80. Red Wolf was a superhero who was had been appointed by the spirits as guardian of the Cheyenne people and granted the mystical powers of the Red Wolf. Also had a wolf named Lobo that traveled around with him. And not long after that, Red Wolf got his own series, but not the same Red Wolf. It was a Western set in the 1800s from an earlier, the adventures of an earlier Cheyenne man who had been granted the powers of Red Wolf. So you got Red Wolf from the 19th century and Red Wolf from the 20th century, both given their powers by the Cheyenne spirits. The modern-day Red Wolf later on interacted with several superheroes beyond just the Avengers, and for a while in the 80s was part of a short-lived all-West superhero team called the Rangers. And there'll be a little bit more about Red Wolf in a bit. Red Wolf was the first Marvel Native American superhero. Scalp Hunter, alias Brian Savage, was a white guy who, as a little child, had been captured and adopted by the Kiowa, and his Kiowa name Kinawote, which means he who is less than human, at least in the comic books. It doesn't actually mean anything in Kiowa because it's not a Kiowa word. But white folks call him Scalp Hunter. He's a bounty hunter, like Jonah Hex. And like Jonah Hex, he first appeared in the pages of Weird Western Tales. Now, out of these three characters, two of the three aren't native at all. They are, they're white folks adopted by a native tribe. In the case of Scalp Hunter, though, you could say, I suppose, he's culturally native because his entire life he's had that native identity. And then the only one of the three who actually is Native American, Red Wolf, the Old West version of Red Wolf, was orphaned as a child and raised by a white couple. So it's kind of like Scalp Hunter in reverse, and only becomes aware of his native heritage when he grows older. All right, well, Red Wolf may have been the first Native American Marvel superhero, but he was not the last. Here are just a few examples. Characters that mostly were introduced in the 1970s and 80s. You got Red Wolf there. You've got Black Crow next to him. Thunderbird, who was one of the new X-Men that debuted in the mid-70s and didn't last very long. He actually got killed off after a few issues. You've got Puma, who started off as a Spider-Man villain, also a member of those Rangers with the Red Wolf. Moonstar, alias Danielle Moonstar, who was a member of the New Mutants, sort of like the junior class of the X-Men. You've got Shaman, who is from a Canadian tribe, a practitioner of magic, and a member of the Canadian super team Alpha Flight. You have Forge, who's also in the X-Men, and he's a mutant, and his mutant power is he's just really, really technologically brilliant. That makes him kind of interesting in the fact that he doesn't have mystical powers. Nothing about his character cries out that it has to be a Native American. He is just this technologically savvy superhero who happens to be Cheyenne. Then you've got American Eagle, and we'll talk more about him in just a second. And then Warpath, who is the younger brother of Thunderbird, also a mutant who wound up in the X-Force and various other groups. So compare that to the Puerto Rican superheroes, or just any Latinx superheroes at Marvel or anywhere else, right? That's more than all of them put together just at Marvel. Kind of similar with, there were a lot of Asian characters, not nearly this many Asian heroes in the 1970s. It's a long-standing American tradition to romanticize Native Americans. All right, well, American Eagle, let's talk a little bit more about him. He was introduced in 1981 in the pages of Marvel 2-in-1, which was a team-up book in which the Thing from the Fantastic Four teamed up with a different other superhero every issue. So that's where he first appeared. He is supposed to be Navajo. Now, if you look at his costume, there is absolutely nothing about that says Navajo. Maybe the fact that he has arrows. But he's got this long, flowing, feathered headdress, which is something that the tribes of the Great Plains did. The desert tribes of the Southwest did not. He does have a very Navajo origin story, though. He was trying to protect a sacred mountain of the Navajo that was being exploited because it was full of uranium. And Ulysses Claw, arch villain of the Black Panthers, they're trying to steal that uranium. If you're familiar at all with the character of Claw from the movies or the comics, you know he likes taking them minerals. And as the character American Eagle is trying to stop him, there's an explosion and he gets superpowers. Nothing mystical about it. It's a scientifically induced super set of power, super speed, and super strength, kind of like a Navajo Superman, but looking really ridiculous, I got to say. He was retooled in 2006, 2007 to make him look a little more believable, a lot less ridiculous, and someone who could pass for a Navajo because he's not dressed up in that garish outfit. In 2016, Red Wolf got some more exposure. He was actually a character. There was this alternate reality Earth story. Don't you just love those? That's set in the Old West on a parallel Earth, and all the characters in it are Marvel superheroes in their secret identities, but they're in the Old West. So it was an entertaining little book. And Red Wolf is a character in that. And that version of Red Wolf gets transported through space and time to the future. Actually, that's the time part, through space, in that he actually winds up on the Earth that the Marvel superheroes live on, which is Earth 616 in Marvel lore. And so he did that, and in that miniseries. Then he got his own miniseries in 2016, Red Wolf. That is his adventures in the 21st century as a deputy sheriff of this small Arizona town. So it introduced him to some new audiences, at least. A couple of other Native American themed heroes whose adventures were not your stereotypical Western adventures were these two. First, Turok, Son of Stone, that debuted in 1954 from Whitman / Dell / Gold Key. Drawn by Rex Mason, and historians still can't figure out who wrote it. There's several people that claimed to have. Turok and his friend Andar were Native Americans from in the American Southwest centuries ago, before the arrival of Europeans, who were traveling in this strange valley, wind up finding an opening to another world, a lost world, where there are, dinosaurs and all kinds of extinct creatures and different types of prehistoric people. So it's kind of a mixture between a Western, kind of a pre-Western, and one of those, Edgar Rice Burroughs type Lost World adventures. Lost Valley, in this case, not Lost World. Scout from Eclipse Comics, we've mentioned them several times if you've noticed, was written and illustrated by Timothy Truman. It also takes place in the desert Southwest. The hero is an Apache, except it's not in the past and it's not in the present. It's in a dystopian future after the United States has exhausted all their natural resources and it's become kind of a Mad Max kind of world. And this character is really well suited and adaptable to function highly in that world. DC Comics have made a lot of efforts down through the years to introduce Native American heroes, and, well, they were well-intentioned. Here's some of the things they came up with. 1949, Pow Wow Smith, who was a Native American, I think he was Lakota, who was the sheriff of a small town. Now, when he was first introduced in the pages of Detective Comics as a backup story behind the Batman story, it was set in the modern era, but pretty quickly it was moved to to an Old West setting. So, Pow Wow Smith, he hates the name, but everyone calls him that anyway. 1961, the character Super Chief is introduced. He's supposed to be an Iroquois Indian. He met Superman. He's got magic powers. He has a buffalo head as a mask. And yet he's Iroquois. I have to assume, Iroquois are from New York, so he must be from Buffalo, New York. Then there's Apache Chief, one of the most cringeworthy characters of all time, who never appeared in DC Comics because he was actually owned by Hanna-Barbera. He appeared in the Super Friends, which was the cartoon that ran all through the 1970s, I think on ABC, if I remember correctly, that featured some of the Justice League. Right? It was Superman, Batman and Robin, Wonder Woman, and Aquaman. And then they wanted to have some diversity, but at that point, DC didn't really have very many diverse characters, so they made some up. And this is what they came up with. Apache Chief, who, when he says the magic word Inukchuk, which, according to the cartoon, was Apache for big man, although it's not and doesn't mean anything. Although it is an Inuit word that means something completely different. But when he would say that magic word, he'd get 50 feet tall. And that was his powers. That was his story. More recently, in this century, 2002, DC introduced a character called Manitou Raven, who's similar to Apache Chief, similar in origin, except he doesn't get 50 feet tall. He has magic powers, but he still says the same magic word. All right, well, more recently, some of the stuff that DC did later on, not counting Apache Chief, at least was some strides forward. Some of the characters they introduced in the 70s, late 1969, Firehair, who's a guy. You'll remember there was another Firehair that was a pretty successful comic in the 40s that was a woman. I guess they couldn't have it be a woman because they might get sued, although not too many companies could sue DC because they bought them all. Anyway, same idea. That's a white guy with red hair, raised by Blackfoot Indians, and he frequently met up with this guy, Hawk, son of Tomahawk. Tomahawk was a white guy, Tom Hawkins, who was a frontiersman a la Davy Crockett, and this is supposed to be his son with his Apache wife, so he's half Apache. And then Scalp Hunter, whom we've already talked about, who was raised by the Kiowa and, kind of an anti-hero. Not really a hero, kind of like Jonah Hex. So, out of these three Native American characters, one actually is half Native American. The other two are, I guess you could say, culturally Native because they were raised by it. But it's still the whole white guy excels in a non-white culture kind of thing. DC, under their Vertigo imprint, we talked about that earlier. That was their adult, sort of mature-only line. In 2007, introduced this series, Scalped, written by Jason Aaron, illustrated by R.M. Guerra. Neither of them native, and it's not a superhero story at all. It is a hard-boiled noir mystery crime drama that lasted 60 issues, exactly 5 years, set on a reservation that's clearly supposed to be the Pine Ridge Lakota Reservation in South Dakota. And the storyline is about this young man, this young Lakota man who had left the reservation and now come to join the military, now comes back kind of with a criminal record and stuff, and gets a job as an enforcer for the corrupt tribal leader who runs the casinos. And turns out that the young man is actually an undercover FBI agent trying to take this guy down. And the guy that runs the casinos, the mob boss, the Lakota mob boss, was at one time an Indian radical American Indian movement member, along with the hero's mother. And so it's very suspenseful, taken simply as a crime drama. It's pretty good. But if you look at the cultural representations, essentially, it is a very, very sordid story that trades on all the modern 21st century negative stereotypes of Native Americans. And a lot of Native people, especially a lot of Lakotas that I know, were very offended by this series. So Scout is one of the books you would not find on the shelves at Red Planet Books and Comics in New Mexico, which is an all-native comic shop. They do have some non-native stuff, but they feature mostly stuff by native artists or on native topics. Owned by Dr. Lee Francis, right there, who established his own publishing company to publish comic books by Native people, about Native people, and for Native people, called Native Realities. And he was instrumental in the organizing of the first Native American comic book convention, the Icon Indigenous Comic-Con, which was first held in 2011 and has been held every subsequent year. So there's a lot of independent comics out there with native subject matter. And then there are some things that are made by Native American writers and or artists for other companies. But the books put out by this company are all by Native, everyone involved is Native American, from the publisher down to the letterers. And here are some of the titles that they've published. Tribal Force actually came out from Mystic Comics in 1996. It was the first all Native American superhero group, but it folded after a short time. Well, it's been brought back by this company with the original creators. So one other person that I want to talk about is the artist behind Deer Woman. And I want to point out before I talk about the artist that this is a major pivotal moment this past decade for Native American representation in comic books, because that representation, just like African American, Asian, Latinx representation, flourishes when people who are part of that group are participants in the creation of those characters and the writing of their stories. That doesn't mean I believe that should be exclusively the case. I don't believe that, writers and artists can only work with characters of their own race or their own group. But I do think that things open up when members of an underrepresented group are able to be in the forefront in telling their own stories, and when people who are not members of that group are respectful of the approach that the group members bring and are willing to incorporate that worldview into their own writing. Okay. Well, anyway, Weshoyat Alvitra, who is a Tongva tribal member from California, has cooperated with Dr. Francis Lee in a graphic novel called Ghost River: The Fall and Rise of the Conestoga in 2019. And it is a graphic novel about the historical incident, the massacre of the Conestoga Indians in Pennsylvania in 1763, a peaceful group of Indians who were slaughtered by an angry mob of white guys who called themselves the Paxton Boys. This was made available for a while for free for educational purposes, and is just one more example of the kind of work coming from Native artists and writers in the 21st century.